Hi. I would like to thank Richard Taylor for inviting me to share with you some of the results of my recent research. Now, it's going to be an example of a case in which I encountered some rather difficult texts of Avicenna and was able, I think, to perhaps shed some light on them by comparing them with the doctrines of a Greek thinker, the Neoplatonic philosopher Porphyry of Tyre, who was born about 234 of our era and died around between 305 and 310. So, if you'll have the patience to stick with me, we'll see whether you find my demonstration convincing. Make sure that you have your handouts handy because this is going to be very much of a text-based exposition, I'm afraid. So, although the eschatological doctrines of Porphyry are not, because of the lacunary state of our documentation, perfectly well known in all their details, we can restore the main outlines with a certain degree of probability. What is certain, in any case, is that in Porphyry, the post-mortem fate of the soul is closely linked to the ethical behavior of the individual during his earthly sojourn, especially by means of the action of the pneumatic body that envelops his soul. Now, we're going to be coming across this term very often. Pneuma in Greek means spirit, and as we shall see, it in this particular context, it refers to a substance that is halfway between material and immaterial. It's a kind of a vapor that consists primarily of fire and of air. As a good Neoplatonist, Porphyry firmly believed in the preexistence of the soul. For him, the particular soul, before its incarnation, is located in the intelligible world, or more exactly, above the sphere of the fixed stars, on the border between the intelligible and the sensible worlds. But it's destined to become incarnate in a body in the sensible world. For this purpose, according to Porphyry's interpretation of the myth of air in Plato's Republic, Book 3, the soul, in its pre-sensible state, must choose between a certain number of lots, kleroi in Greek, which prescribe the existence it will lead on earth. Now, this choice is free, but it's going to subsequently dictate all the details of the individual's earthly existence. In fact, this choice turns out to be double. At first, the soul chooses a kind of a generic existence, a man or a dog, for instance. And this first choice then induces the soul to delve into the world of the 7 planetary spheres and to choose one zodiacal sign that suits him. Once there, it's going to have to make a second choice. It's shown as if projected on a screen a whole range of stellar constellations, each of which indicates the specific existence that the soul will lead on Earth. For instance, if the soul first chose the life of a man, this second choice will determine if it's the life of a soldier, a merchant, or a philosopher that it's going to lead. If it chose the soul of a dog, then this second choice will specify whether the dog in question is going to be a hunting dog, a lap dog, a guard dog, or what have you. In any case, when the time comes for the soul to become incarnate in a human body, there are 2 ways to consider this process of animation. According to the first one, and we find this described in Porphyry's treatise Ad Gaurum on the animation of the embryo, this process by which a rational soul enters the body takes place instantaneously from the moment in which a human body that is adapted or appropriate, oikeion is the Greek word, emerges from the mother's womb. Prior to this point, the fetus possessed only the soul of a plant. From another perspective, however, in this process of animation, which is still timeless but now envisaged as unfolding through a number of distinct stages, the soul, destined to become incarnated in a human body, must undertake a stellar journey that will bring it from the supercelestial world to the earth. However, since it's an incorporeal entity, the soul cannot move locally, deprived as it is of any spatio-temporal location. In order to be transported, therefore, it must use a vessel, ochima in Greek, considered as a kind of vehicle of the soul, which, as we said, was made of an almost material substance, the pneuma. Now, we have on this doctrine the testimony of the Neoplatonist Proclus, who attributes it to what he called Porphyry's followers, and here you have your text 1. Others, with more moderation than the first ones, like Porphyry, and more benignity, refuse to spread what is called destruction about the vehicle and the irrational soul. So, let's step back for a bit. The context is Proclus is giving a kind of a list of what various philosophers thought happened to the irrational soul after death, and the soul, the vehicle of the soul. So, the body dies. What happens to the irrational soul, and what happens to the vehicle of the soul? Some people, the Middle Platonists notably, but people like Albinus, said that both of them are destroyed. And then Proclus moves on to Porphyry and his followers. They refuse to say that they're both destroyed, and he says that these two things, the vehicle of the soul and the irrational soul, dissolve and resolve themselves in some way into the spheres, that is to say the celestial spheres, from which they were constituted, and that they are mixtures, pheramata in Greek, derived from the spheres which the soul collects during its descent. These people are, says Proclus, in agreement with the oracles, that is to say the Chaldean oracles, who say that in its descent the soul collects the elements of the vehicle, taking, and here's a quote from the oracles, a portion of the ether, and of the sun and the moon, and all that floats in the air. So, we can see from this testimony that the formation of the ochima, pneuma, is a doctrine of the Chaldean oracles, fragment 61 de Plas to be specific, according to which the vehicle of the soul is collected, sylegein in Greek, from the celestial spheres during its descent. According to the testimony of Proclus, this vehicle is formed from the mixtures derived from the celestial spheres, to which the soul restores them when, after the individual dies, the soul undertakes its ascent toward the intelligible world through these same spheres, but this time upwards in the reverse order to the one it took when it came down. Now, one of the most explicit testimonies on the mechanism of acquisition and abandonment of the vehicle of the soul is provided to us by a Latin source, Macrobius, who wrote around 430, and who, in his commentary on the dream of Scipio, depends largely on one or more of the now lost works from Porphyry, according to most historians of philosophy. Macrobius describes the doctrine of a group of Platonists, according to which the individual soul, initially located in the sphere of the fixed stars, is suddenly seized by a desire for earthly things. Rendered heavy and driven downwards by this very desire, she begins her descent through the 7 spheres toward the earth. And this is our text 2. Macrobius writes, "She did not suddenly dawn a body of clay from a state of complete incorporeality, but gradually undergoing imperceptible losses and moving further and further away from her state of absolute simple purity, she swells up, owing to certain increases from a stellar body. In each of the spheres beneath the sky, she is clothed with an ethereal envelope, so that by this means she reconciles herself to the company of this clay garment, that is to say, the body, and in this way she passes through as many deaths as she traverses spheres, until she reaches that which here on earth is called life." So, Macrobius' source, probably Porphyry here, thus considers this envelope, obvolutio in Latin, of the soul, which is made up of the augmentations it receives from each sphere, as a sort of preparation for the reception of the human body, which is made of flesh and bone. Now, given the Neoplatonic doctrine of continuity, according to which nature makes no leaps, two entities as different as an incorporeal soul and a material body cannot come into immediate contact. They need an intermediary of a nature that is halfway between the two extremes, and this is precisely the role of the ochima pneuma. Macrobius continues by providing more details about the acquisition of this pneumatic vehicle of the soul. This is your text 3. The soul, he writes, having begun its descent from the intersection of the zodiac and the middle way to the underlying spheres, as it glides through them, not only is it draped in these envelopes, in each of them, as we said, when it approaches the luminous body, but also it produces each of the movements that it will use subsequently. The movements in question here are psychical movements. Indeed, in the sphere of Saturn, it acquires reasoning and intelligence, which is called logistikon and theoretikon. Note that Gropius is quoting Greek here, so he's obviously working from a Greek source. In the sphere of Jupiter, it acquires the power of thinking, which is called praktikon. In the sphere of Mars, which is called ardor, thumikon. In the sphere of the Sun, it acquires the nature of feeling and opining, which is called aesthetikon and fantastikon. In the sphere of Venus, it acquires the movement of enunciating. In the sphere of Venus, it acquires the movement of desire, which is called epithumetikon. In the sphere of Mercury, it acquires the movement of enunciating and interpreting what it feels, which is called hermeneutikon. And as for the phytikon, that is to say, the nature capable of sowing and increasing the body, it exercises it upon its entry into the sphere of the moon. So, here we see that the human soul, by the time it arrives on Earth, finds itself surrounded by an envelope, which, although it is quasi-material, nevertheless already contains all the psychic features of which it will be making use during its earthly existence. Now, so although this ochima pneuma is thus described as the seat of all infra-rational psychic powers, it comes to be identified during the individual's earthly existence with the faculties of imagination and common sense. According to Porphyry, the faculty of the imagination works by projection, probole, from the Greek verb proballo, to emit, to shed forth, to project, literally to throw forth. According to Synesius, for example, who probably depends on Porphyry in his work De Insomniis, the human soul possesses the logoi, the rational formulae, of all things. However, in order to become aware of the presence of these logoi, it must project them onto the faculty of the imagination, as if upon a mirror, or, as we could say today, as if on a television or a movie screen. Indeed, Synesius continues, it is only when the imprints, the ekmageia, of these things reach the faculty of the imagination that the soul is able to perceive its own contents. This is what allows us to describe imaginative perception, especially during sleep, as a more sacred sensible faculty, thanks to which we enter into communication with the gods, receiving from them prophecies, healings, and other gifts. So, now this ochima pneuma, which continues to envelop the soul throughout the course of its earthly existence, plays a key role in the psychology and the ethics of Porphyry of Tyre. It connects the soul and the body, and it fulfills the psychological functions of imagination and common sense. This is true not only for the soul of the human individual, but also for the soul of the world, the hypostasis, that is, and for the soul of demons. Indeed, the demons, which are invisible by nature, are able to make themselves visible through the figures that they imprint upon their pneuma. If the demons rejoice in the bloody sacrifices and libations of the traditional Greek religion, it is because the pneumatic part of their being is fattened, in Greek piainetai, by them, since this part, and I quote, lives by vapors and exhalations. The same holds true for human souls. During their descent through the celestial spheres to the body, as we read in Porphyry's On the Cave of the Nymphs, De Anthro-Nympharum, souls that love the body drag a moist pneuma with them and render it dense like a rain cloud. They cause it to condense, in other words, which allows them to become visible. And if the demons are able to change shape, it's because they exert an effect on their pneumatic body through their will and their imagination, just as a person's imagination can make them blush or turn pale without any need for physical contact. Now, this last testimony comes from a text that's attributed to the Byzantine polymath Michael Psellos in the 13th century. But the fact that the doctrine in question is in fact Porphyrian is shown by a fragment of Porphyry's commentary on the Timaeus, which is preserved by Proclus once again. And this is your text 4. Moreover, writes Proclus, imagination, by its mere influence, produces many changes in the body. If a person imagines some indecent object, he is ashamed and turns red, he blushes. If he conceives of a danger, he is seized with fright and turns green. These changes no doubt occur in the body, but the cause is the representation, the fantasia, which does not use pushings or leverages, but acts by its presence alone. Again, according to the theologians, there are some powers superior to us who, through their use of effective imaginations, destrasterioi fantasiae, are able, as soon as they have presented themselves, to carry out whatever effects they wish. These powers produce illuminations, and by their movements they reveal certain divine figures, in the sense that they manifest these visions externally to those who are able to see them. Now here we find several themes that we've already encountered. The imagination, a faculty which is assimilated to the pneuma, is midway between the corporeal and the incorporeal, and it acts as an intermediary between the soul and the body. Now, it is able to produce physical effects on the body by a mode of causality that's different from the efficient causality we observe in the physical world. We also find the analogy we had already seen with the modus operandi of the demons. Although this modality, which as we know from other texts of Porphyry, consists in projecting the contents of their imagination onto the pneumatic body that envelops them, is not specified here, everything indicates that we are dealing with the same phenomenon. The demons are able not only to change their own form, but also to make all kinds of supernatural apparitions appear on their pneuma, as if on a screen. And one thinks here of the apparitions that the initiates in the Eleusinian mysteries were supposed to enjoy. Finally, this vehicle of the soul reflects and is influenced by the ethical behavior of the individual. Just as the pneumatic body of demons is, as we have seen, fattened by the exhalations emitted by the burnt flesh of sacrificial victims, so a human life devoted to pleasures and bodily indulgences, related to excesses in matters of drink, food, or sexual activity, is likely to increase the humidity level of that vehicle and thus make it heavier. In contrast, a disciplined lifestyle, subject to moderation and even to asceticism, is able to make the vehicle of the soul drier and therefore lighter. The quasi-physical line of reasoning that we see here is the basis of Porphyry's eschatological doctrine. We're going to see a little later that in Porphyry's sentence number 29, at the moment of death, considered as the separation of the soul from the body, the vehicle of the soul of an individual who has led a life characterized by excess and indulgence in the bodily appetites is weighed down by this unnatural way of life and is immediately dragged downwards and ends up in Hades. Correspondingly, the dryness and lightness of the soul vehicle of a person who has led a moderate existence allow the soul to realize its reascent towards the intelligible world without hindrance and immediately. So much for Porphyry, the Neoplatonist, writing in Greek, although he was born in what is now Lebanon, in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE. So now we're going to fast forward about 600 years to the period of Avicenna. And we're going to switch cultures and languages. I'm going to be speaking about works composed in Arabic. And we're going to ask ourselves, is there any evidence in Avicenna of eschatological doctrines reminiscent of what we've just seen in Porphyry? The answer is yes, in my opinion. In the Avicennian treatise on Genesis and Return, for example, we find the following passage, and this is your text 5. Someone among the people of science, writes Avicenna, Ahl al-Ilm, of those who do not speak lightly, said something possible. i.e. this: when human beings abandon their bodies while still being bodily, badaniyuna, and they have no attachment to what is higher than the body, an attachment such that the continuous attention to it and their attachment to it would distract them from bodily things, when their souls have the sole merit of having been the ornament of their bodies, and they do not know anything other than bodies and bodily things, it is possible that a certain species of desire that these people have for their body will make them attach themselves to other bodies, whose role it would be for these souls to attach themselves to them. These bodies would be different from the human and animal bodies of which we have spoken. It may be a celestial body, Jirman Samawiyan. Not that these souls become souls for those bodies, or rule them, this is not possible, but in the sense that they would use these bodies to make possible their activity or imagination. These people would then imagine that the forms that constituted their belief and were located in their estimative faculty, in their wahm, these souls would imagine these forms, if in itself and its actions this belief was good and necessarily implied happiness, they would see beauty. So, here we have Avicenna reporting the opinion of a thinker whom he chooses not to name, but for whom he obviously has some respect, and whose views, he thinks, must be taken seriously. According to this doctrine, when at the moment of death the soul leaves the body in a state of ignorance of the intelligible, of persistent attachment to bodies, and of lack of attachment to the world above, in other words, presumably, when the soul in question has not practiced philosophy to the point of being able to achieve contact with the intelligibles and to free itself from its habitual concerns with the sensible world, that soul remains bodily, and it maintains, even after death, a kind of attraction to or desire for bodies. We can thus assume, Avicenna thinks, that such a soul will want to and be able to attach itself to another body after death. Now, Avicenna rejects any doctrine of transmigration of souls or metempsychosis. However, he also thinks that every imaginative act needs a physical substrate. So, it follows that the soul in its post-mortem condition must find a body capable of serving as a substrate for its imaginative faculty. And everything indicates that, in Avicenna's view, it's the celestial bodies, the stars and the planets, that are best able to fulfill this function. But what kind of attachment are we talking about here in the case of this post-mortem attachment of the soul to a celestial body? Avicenna doesn't explain this point in a way that's perfectly clear. He merely says, as we have seen, that the soul in question, and I quote, uses this body to render imagination or sensible representation possible. However, he does give some further indication in what follows. What happens, he says, is that through its imagination, which has now been made possible by involving a celestial body, the soul will represent to itself all the experiences promised and described in sacred scripture, the sensory and sensual pleasures for those who have lived according to the law, and the corporeal punishments and sufferings by fire for those who have neglected the precepts of Islam. I think we can immediately see the interest of a solution like this. As a good representative of the falsafa, that is to say, the school that follows, grosso modo, Greek philosophy, especially of an Aristotelian tendency, Avicenna rejects as absurd and unseemly any notion of a physical resurrection of the body. However, he also has no desire to reject all the eschatological promises contained in the Quran and in the traditions. One cannot impute a lie either to God or to the prophet. This doctrine of the imaginary eschatology thus allows Avicenna to safeguard the veracity of these promises. The soul of the non-philosophical believer will truly experience in the afterlife all the experiences that Scripture promises, but this will happen not in the context of a bodily resurrection, judged to be philosophically abhorrent, but through the imagination of the soul that uses a celestial body for that purpose. So, both the philosophical preoccupations that trouble Avicenna and the solution of imaginary eschatology that he seems to have finally adopted are reminiscent of the doctrines of Porphyry. Needless to say, Porphyry, like Avicenna, completely rejects the doctrine, Christian in his case, of the resurrection of the body. But for Porphyry too, the post-mortem punishments described by the Greek tradition, by Homer, by Hesiod, by Plato, and the Orphics, among others, are not just to be rejected. Such punishments, he thinks, are real. However, they are not physical processes, but they take place on the level of the imagination. In the fragments of Porphyry's lost work on the Styx, we read the following passage, and this is your text 6. Those souls who have crossed the river, he is talking about the river Acheron, are struck by oblivion, having let go the reasoning that concerns human affairs. That is why the places of punishment of the unjust are found outside of the river, since they have their punishment through reasoning and the remembrance of what they have experienced. For they receive representations, phantasiae, of the horrible things that they have done, and they are punished in that their misdeeds are present to them by reasoning, and they punish them by means of the punishments assigned to misdeeds. Hence the fact that some of these souls are punished by the impression of carrying stones and being crushed, while others receive representations, phantasias, of eternal thirst and hunger, and others receive representations of something else that terrified them during life. So, just as Avicenna explains that the punishments and the rewards promised by Scripture to souls after their death occur to them by means of their imaginative or representative faculty, in a very similar way, Porphyry argues that the condemnations that Homer described as being inflicted in Hades on the souls of Sisyphus and Tantalus only afflict them through their imagination. By remembering the crimes they have committed during their earthly life, these souls will be afflicted in the beyond by visions of, quote-unquote, what has terrified them during life. Thus, Sisyphus will have the impression of indefinitely rolling a huge stone up to the top of a slope, only to have it come crashing down against him, while Tantalus will be harassed by the representation of thirst and hunger perpetually unsatisfied. We can assume that for Porphyry, these Homeric myths merely exemplify the post-mortem destiny of any soul that has been guilty of grave fault during its earthly existence. Now, this direct testimony from a lost work of Porphyry is confirmed by Synesius, who, as we've already seen, probably draws his inspiration here as often from Porphyry. And this is your text 7. Synesius writes, as for this psychic pneuma, that blessed men also call the pneumatic soul, it becomes a god, a multiform demon, and a ghost, and it is in this pneuma that the soul expiates its sentences. Finally, it's probably due to the influence of Porphyry as well that we find the same idea in the young St. Augustine, especially in De Genesi et Littera. I wrote a paper on that back in 2005. But back to Avicenna. We've seen that he's not very talkative about the exact mechanism by which the soul of the non-philosophical believer, after its separation from the body at death, uses a celestial body to make possible the activity of its imaginative faculty. Based on the testimony of Synesius, however, we can risk the following suggestion. Just as according to Synesius, the soul, which contains the logoi of all things, does not become aware of these logoi before its intellect projects them onto the screen of the imagination or the common sense, we can suppose that for Avicenna, the soul, in its post-mortem condition, uses a celestial body to project the content of its imagination as if on a screen, and that this is the way that it perceives and experiences the realization of the eschatological promises of Scripture. Now, in the continuation of our Avicennan text from the treatise on Genesis and Return, we come across the following passage. This is your text 8. It is also possible, said this scholar, that this body is engendered from the air, smoke, and vapors. It may be of a complexion close to that substance that is called pneuma, ruh in Arabic, a substance to which the soul adheres, as the physicians do not doubt. It is not, after all, to the body that the soul attaches itself. Now, if it were possible that this pneuma, once separated from the body and its humors, does not dissolve, but remains, then the soul would adhere to it psychically. So here we find a theory that seems even closer to the one that we found in Porphyry. The body to which the soul of the unsophisticated believer attaches itself after death is not that of a celestial body, but it's made up of pneuma, ruh in Arabic. That is to say, a substance made of air, smoke, and vapors. This is all Avicenna has to say about this doctrine here, and he refrains from giving his opinion on the doctrine of this scholar. However, in a parallel passage from another text, entitled The Treatise on Future Happiness, Avicenna provides us with more details. This is your text 9. He writes, "And some sages say that if the soul separates from the body and carries with it the estimative faculty, the wahm, in the way we have already mentioned, it is impossible for her to get rid of her body, to get rid of the purified body, without being accompanied by a certain natural disposition, at-tabi'iyya. After death, it imagines itself to be the man who is dead, and that it is according to her appearance, as it did in its dreams. The soul thinks that it is buried, and it imagines the suffering that comes to it in the form of the customary sensible punishments. If the soul is happy, it imagines this in a form worthy of praise, in a sensible form, and according to what it believed and knew well about happy people. They say also that it is not surprising that one imagines such an admirable form, and that there should be visible to the soul in the hereafter all the states mentioned in the books of the prophets, such as gardens, the hur with big eyes, and other similar things." So, all in all, this text has both similarities to and differences from the one we saw a bit earlier from the book of Genesis and Return. In this passage, instead of a soul that remains bodily at the moment of death, we hear about a soul that takes its estimative faculty with it, and nothing is said of any connection with a celestial body. In this text, the eschatological promises of the prophetic books are realized by means of the faculty of the imagination. But this time, it's the parallel with dreamlike experiences, strongly emphasized by Synesius, that is strongly emphasized. But what seems to me most interesting about this passage is a brief little passage at the end of it, and this is your text 10. Here we read that Thabit ibn Qurra has a strange doctrine. He thinks that souls separate themselves from the body, enveloped in a subtle body, jism latif. Now this, Avicenna says, doesn't make any sense unless what's being referred to is some kind of a symbol. So here, Avicenna mentions a theory which he attributes to Thabit ibn Qurra, according to which, at the moment of death, the soul emerges from the physical body enveloped in a subtle body. Avicenna had already mentioned this theory, which he finds scandalous, earlier on in the same book during his discussion of metempsychosis. And this is your text 11. Even more amazing than that, he says, is his assertion that the soul carries with it from the body a subtle body, a jism, that is not like other bodies, and that it does not free itself from matter all at once, but only after a while. So let's leave aside for a moment Avicenna's objections to this body. What interests us here in this testimony is once again the idea of a subtle body that accompanies the human soul after death. Now, this body is mysterious in nature, or at least Avicenna and his sources claim to be astounded by it, and they claim they don't understand it, but it's clearly material in nature. We also learn that the soul takes a certain time in its post-mortem state to get rid of its materiality. And here, I think we're clearly in the same register of ideas as the one we encounter in sentence 29 of our friend, the Neoplatonist Porphyry. And this is your text 12. Porphyry writes, "Indeed, when it, that is the human soul, emerges from the solid body, the pneuma, which it had collected from the spheres, accompanies it. But since, because of its attraction to the body, it has projected a particular logos, according to which it obtained a relationship with the body qualified in a specific way during life, as a result of this attraction, an impression from the imagination imprints itself on the pneuma, and that is how it drags its image along with it. It is said to be in Hades because the pneuma has received an invisible and obscure nature as its lot." I should explain the context here. The question Porphyry is trying to answer, as Jean Pépin and others have proved, is why in the Odyssey does Homer speak about an image, an eidolon of Heracles that is present in Hades when Heracles, as a god, is in heaven at the same time. How can that be? And this is Porphyry's explanation. It's not the case that Heracles or his soul really is in Hades. It's just that he's dragging along a pneumatic image. So this correspondence between the theory of Porphyry and the one that Avicenna attributes to Thabit ibn Qurra seems to me to be really quite interesting. We should recall that Thabit ibn Qurra was a great mathematician, astronomer, translator, and philosopher. And, most importantly, he was the most illustrious member of the community of the Sabaeans of Haran, which, according to the well-known and still highly controversial theory of Michel Tardieu, inherited Neoplatonism from the last 7 Neoplatonists of the school of Athens who sought refuge in this Mesopotamian city upon the closing of the school by Justinian in 529 CE. So, we're finally coming to the conclusion. What can we conclude at the end of this journey with regard to the relations between the eschatological doctrines of Porphyry and of Avicenna? Here we've been mainly interested in the similarities between these two conceptual structures, and they seem to me to be considerable. The psychology of Avicenna is roughly the same as that of the Neoplatonist masters of the end of Greco-Roman antiquity, and is therefore not surprising if there are parallels in this area with the thought of Porphyry, who, along with others, such as Alexander of Aphrodisius, Plotinus, Themistius, Philoponus, and so on, was at the origin of the Neoplatonic psychological doctrine taken up by the Arabic-speaking Falasifa. We have seen that Avicenna, like Porphyry, probably for quite similar reasons, finds the doctrine of the resurrection of the body repugnant. However, since both of them believe in the immortality of the soul and in an afterlife, they adapted the solution of an imaginary eschatology. Note that I'm speaking of an imaginary eschatology here, one that takes place by means of and through the imagination, and not simply an imaginal eschatology. However, these similarities should not be exaggerated to the point of neglecting the fundamental differences that separate our two thinkers. The most basic of these is probably the following. Avicenna denies the pre-existence of the soul, which according to him is created by God at the instant when a body apt to act as its host comes into existence. There can therefore be no question in Avicenna of any heavenly journey of the soul through the spheres. For Avicenna, the pneuma, which he recognizes as crucially important for psychology, and which, like Porphyry, he sometimes identifies with the common sense as a sense of the senses that is actually responsible for grasping sensitive objects, cannot therefore originate in a series of accretions acquired from the planetary spheres. On the contrary, Avicenna defends a concept of the pneuma that is reminiscent of Nemesius of Emesa, who in turn takes up Aristotelian and especially Galenic doctrines. So for Avicenna, the pneuma is something that's strictly bodily. It plays an important psychological and medical role, but it cannot be collected from the celestial spheres. during the descent of the soul, because there is no descent of the soul for Avicenna. So Avicenna is just merely being consistent when he rejects the doctrine of Thabit ibn Qurra, according to which the human soul emerges from the body after death wrapped in a pneumatic body. Avicenna goes on to explain, in fact, that such a pneuma, since it is extremely subtle, would be immediately volatilized once it leaves the body, and elements of foreign origin would combine with it, which would prevent this pneuma from fulfilling its function as a substrate for the faculty of the imagination. The fact remains, however, that for Avicenna, and probably for Porphyry as well, the soul of the individual who dies in a state of imperfection is able to perfect itself further after death. As for Porphyry, we do not know the details of this posthumous process of purification, although it's very likely that according to him, the rites prescribed by the Chaldean oracles, supposed to be able to purify what Augustine, citing Porphyry in the lost work De Regressu Animae, calls the pars spiritualis animae among non-philosophers, played a part in it. We are not much better informed about the details of Avicenna's doctrine on this subject. Sometimes he seems ready to consider the possibility of a heavenly influx from the agent intellect, able to carry out the progressive purification of souls even after death. Sometimes he considers a role played by the stars in this process. In any case, the post-mortem possession of a faculty of the imagination is indispensable, as Avicenna says, quote, for the soul to learn from its imagination the various things that can be known. It will then improve, unquote. However, as we've seen several times, for Avicenna, no survival of a faculty of imagination or common sense is possible without the presence of a bodily substrate. Hence the idea, which Avicenna doesn't seem ready to reject, however bizarre and incomprehensible it may seem to us, of the soul's use of a celestial body as a kind of a projection screen on which the soul could visualize, as if in an open-air cinema, the fulfillment of the eschatological promises of Scripture. In short, it seems that we're dealing here with a case where, among the multiple influences which Avicenna was exposed to, Gnosticizing, Hermeticizing, astrological, magical, Sufi, Iranian, and so on, there were a number of doctrines of Porphyrian origin. But, true to his habit, Avicenna, who didn't have a very high opinion of Porphyry, probably because some of Porphyry's doctrines seem to have been quite popular among Avicenna's rivals and opponents, including the Peripatetics of Baghdad, Avicenna reworked, retouched, and re-elaborated these doctrines until he thoroughly transformed them. Porphyry's thought is sometimes very hard to grasp, among other things because he was striving to reconcile and remain faithful to very different sources, to Plato and Aristotle, to Plotinus and the Chaldean oracles, to the Greco-Roman religious tradition, to Neo-Pythagoreanism, and to the henotheism of the end of antiquity. This is even more true for Avicenna, and this explains, at least in part, why his statements sometimes seem contradictory, as well as the difficulty which modern interpreters have in grasping his philosophical theological positions. Faithful to the canonical texts of Islam, a great admirer of Aristotle but deeply imbued with Neoplatonism, Avicenna is also engaged in the daunting task of reconciling his sources while remaining true to himself and his own assumptions, such as his denial of metempsychosis and the pre-existence of the soul. Like Porphyry, he seems to have wound up developing a grandiose eschatological vision in which the veracity of the promises of the prophetic books is safeguarded, while the resurrection of the body, judged to be physically and morally inadmissible, is discreetly cast aside. Now, we don't know many of the details of this doctrine, which is likely to have been the subject of much more substantial development in some of Avicenna's writings that are lost today, such as the notorious and controversial Wisdom of the East. But the same holds true for Porphyry, most of whose immense literary production is lost or survives only in the state of fragments. It certainly seems, nevertheless, that both Porphyry and Avicenna were searching for an eschatological doctrine capable of ensuring a satisfactory post-mortem destiny that agreed with the sacred scriptures of their respective cultures. Not so much for the wise and for philosophers, who, in the view of both of our philosophers, return after death immediately to the intelligible world, never again to have to deal with the world of bodies. Rather, these doctrines were invented for the sake of the vast majority of the human race, the non-philosophers. Now, these people, dominated by their passions, ignorant of the existence of an intelligible world, and unable to practice philosophy, can, according to Porphyry, nevertheless return to the ethereal realm after death, thanks to the purification of their pneumatic body as carried out by the theurgy preached by the Chaldean oracles. Likewise, Avicenna also grants to the non-philosophers a post-mortem destiny that suits them, in which, as long as they have led a virtuous life on an ethical and a religious level, they will be able to enjoy the rewards promised by Scripture. Jean Michaud has suggested that according to Avicenna, even these non-philosophers will be able to continue to make ethical progress in the afterlife to the point where they get tired of the sensual and corporeal pleasures they're enjoying in their imagination, and they may eventually join the wise and the philosophers in their eternal stay in the intelligible world. Now, was this already the case for Porphyry, who, according to the testimony of Augustine, spent his whole life in search of a via universalis animae liberandi? We don't know, but it's not impossible that the continued editing, translation, and in-depth analysis, on the one hand of the fragments of Porphyry, and on the other hand of certain writings of Avicenna, such as his notes on the theology of Aristotle, may in the long run end up shedding some light on these crucial issues. Thanks very much for your attention.